This is the Social Skills Mastery Podcast, episode 260. To really compete as a professional or business owner, you have to own the room. That's why each week I bring you hot topics, tips, and expert interviews so you can stand out in competitive places. Let's get started. Hey, quick question. Do you ever find your heart racing right before a big moment? When the spotlight hits and your brain suddenly forgets who you are, that's not a confidence problem. That's your inner critic hijacking the controls. And I built Confidence on Cue to fix that fast. It's a short, powerful 5-minute audio that resets your mind before any meeting, presentation, or social interaction. It helps you quiet overthinking, center your energy, and step in as the impactful, impressive professional people trust and remember. When the moment matters, your mind should be your ally, not your biggest obstacle. It trains your thoughts, emotions, and energy to work together so you walk in composed, clear, and compelling. Go grab it now at socialconfidencepro.com/switch. It'll change how you show up in every high-stakes moment from here on out. Here's a thought that might make you uncomfortable, and if it does, maybe that's good. If your interpersonal skills, your social confidence, and your professional polish look essentially the same as they did a year ago, it's not because you're busy, and it's not because you're introverted, and it's not because you're too analytical, and it's also not because you just haven't had the right opportunity yet. It's because you believed the same thoughts this year that you believed last year. That's it. And before your brain jumps in to argue with me, because I know it will, just stay with me, because if you're a high-achieving professional, especially one who prides themselves on being rational and capable and self-aware, this episode is going to land in a way that you might not expect. Because most professionals don't fail to improve their people skills because they lack ability. They fail because they never question the assumptions that they made about themselves decades ago. And it's those assumptions that continue to dictate behavior long after they're no longer accurate. And this episode is about those assumptions. Many of the professionals and founders that I work with solve problems for a living, and they're trusted with enormous responsibility. And yet when it comes to social confidence, interpersonal ease, executive presence, or even basic professional polish, they often say things like, "I've never been good at that." Here's what I want you to hear very clearly. Those statements aren't descriptions of reality. They're nothing more than thoughts that your brain learned to think and never updated. And I'm going to show you exactly why that matters, and even more importantly, what to do about it. Because here's what I've observed working with some of the most analytically brilliant people in finance, tech, and medicine. The gap between their technical capability and their interpersonal impact isn't a skills gap, it's a thought gap. And you can debug complex systems and perform intricate procedures or structure major deals. And when it comes to working a room or leading with presence or appearing as polished as you are competent, suddenly the story changes to, "I'm just not built for that." But that's not a fact. That's nothing more than a belief that you've been practicing for so long, it feels like the truth. So the question is, why does your brain choose competence over connection? Well, one of the most overlooked reasons smart people remain socially, let's say, stagnant is that early in life, your brain learned a very specific survival strategy. What it learned was that competence was safe, and being knowledgeable was rewarded, and being correct was praised, right? And also being capable, well, that brought approval. And social situations, on the other hand, well, those always felt unpredictable and messy and subjective, full of variables that you couldn't control. So your brain did exactly what an intelligent brain does. In other words, it doubled down on what worked. Let me paint a picture for you of how this actually plays out. Let's say you're 12 years old and you don't know how to navigate the social politics of middle school. Who does, right? You don't understand the unwritten rules. You feel awkward and uncertain and in some ways exposed. Then you discover something. When you focus on schoolwork and when you excel academically and when you become the person with the right answers in class, adults praise you and your parents are proud and your teachers notice you and Now you found a comfortable place where you're accepted, and competence becomes your safety net. And in the midst of all of that, your brain learns that social uncertainty, well, that's dangerous, and technical competence is safe. Just think about that for a moment. That's not a conscious decision. It's a neurological one. And over time, you didn't just develop technical skill, you identified with it. And anything that threatened that identity began to feel unnecessary or even dangerous. This is why so many super accomplished people unconsciously treat investing in their social growth as optional or, worse, frivolous. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that your work speaks for itself, and that people who focus on professional polish are compensating for a lack of substance. And you've watched less capable people get promoted past you, and you've seen them command rooms where you're smarter than everyone in it. You've noticed that they get the benefit of the doubt, and the face time with leadership, and the invitations to the meetings that are important. And this is also why statistics like the often cited Harvard-Stanford research showing that roughly 85% of long-term career success is driven by interpersonal effectiveness, while only 15% is technical skill, are perennially intellectually acknowledged and behaviorally ignored. And you still don't change, because logic doesn't drive change. Your belief does. And you know your brain doesn't evaluate social behaviors morally, it evaluates them neurologically. And at some point, often very early, your brain categorized things like conversational ease, professional polish, having knowledge of the proper manners, and presence as high exposure behaviors. That means they carry the potential for embarrassment, judgment, or rejection. And once something is categorized that way, your brain doesn't debate you about it. It just steers you away. And that makes sense. So instead of thinking this is a skill I could develop, you think, that's just not for me. And that thought feels natural and rational or even mature. It's actually a protective mechanism, and protective mechanisms don't evolve unless they're questioned. Let me give you a concrete example of how this shows up. You're in a meeting with senior executives, and someone makes a comment, and you have a genuinely valuable perspective that you want to add to the conversation. But before you speak, your brain runs a rapid calculation, and thoughts bob up to the surface like, what if I phrase it wrong? Or what if it sounds too aggressive or too soft? And what if everyone looks at me? So what do? You stay quiet, and afterward you tell yourself a story. I'm just more comfortable listening. I like to think things through. That's just who I am. But that's not who you are. That's who your brain decided you needed to be when you were much younger, much younger, and much less capable. But the truth is your nervous system flagged that moment as risky years ago, and it's still running that same program from middle school. This isn't about forcing yourself to be someone that you're not. This is about recognizing that the person your brain thinks you need to protect actually no longer exists. You're not the uncertain 12-year-old anymore who needed to hide behind competence. You're a highly capable, skilled, knowledgeable professional with expertise and authority and lots of added value. And your thoughts have not caught up yet. Now, let's talk about something many people quietly dismiss, and that's social manners and etiquette. Not because they think it's useless, but because they associate it with a different type of person. Someone more polished, and someone more socially fluent, and someone who grew up with advantages that they didn't have. So instead of seeing etiquette as a learnable system, they see it as a personality trait. I hear this all the time from my clients. I didn't grow up learning which fork to use. That stuff isn't me. And I understand that instinct because etiquette can feel like a class marker, like something that's for people who went to boarding school or who grew up in country clubs. But here's the irony. Etiquette exists for one reason, and that's to reduce social uncertainty. It's not about being fancy or rigid or pretending to be someone that you're not. What it does is remove friction so everyone feels comfortable around you. Just think about what etiquette actually does. It tells you when to speak and when to listen, and it gives you a script for introduction so no one feels awkward. And it provides structure for meals and meetings and events so everyone knows what to expect. So, in other words, etiquette is just a system. And through your profession, you can acknowledge that you're very good at learning systems. You learned programming languages and financial modeling and the unwritten rules of your technical field. But you've convinced yourself that social systems are different and that they require some innate quality that you lack. And that's just simply not true. And research in organizational psychology consistently shows that people who are perceived as socially calibrated, who understand timing and tone and boundaries and courtesies, are rated as much more competent and more leadership ready, even when their actual performance is identical. By the way, that's not unfair. That's just human psychology. People make decisions about your capability just based on how you make them feel. And polish, like real, genuine, human social polish, it makes people feel at ease. And when you know how to navigate a room and when you understand conversational rhythm, which allows you to read a situation and adjust accordingly, people just trust you a lot faster. Not because you're performing, rather because you're reducing their uncertainty. That's strategic, intelligent, and worth learning, wouldn't you think? Most professionals believe that they avoid social growth because it feels uncomfortable, and that's not actually what's happening. What you're avoiding is identity conflict, because if you have spent years seeing yourself as the serious one or the analytical one or the expert, then stepping into polish and presence doesn't feel uncomfortable. It feels destabilizing. It doesn't feel like you. And your brain asks questions like, if I become more socially fluent, who am I then? Will people expect something different from me, or will I lose the safety of being underestimated? Let me tell you what this looks like in practice. I worked with the managing director at a private equity firm who was exceptionally smart. He built models that saved his firm millions, but in partner meetings, he deferred and waited to be asked his opinion, and overall, he just downplayed his ideas. And when we started working together, he told me that I've just never been the guy who speaks up. It's not my style. But as we dug into it, here's what we uncovered. He grew up in a family where being too visible was punished, and his father was volatile, and the safest strategy was to just be competent but invisible. That strategy may have worked when he was young, but it doesn't work now, and his brain is still protecting a version of him that no longer exists. So instead of consciously choosing not to grow, you unconsciously protect the identity that already worked. This is why information alone never changes behavior. You can read every book on executive presence, and you can know intellectually that visibility matters, and you can want to change. But if your identity hasn't shifted, your behavior won't either. And it's why your thoughts, not your effort, are the real gatekeepers. Lots of professionals apply a form of what I call self-bullying. They tell themselves to speak up more, they push themselves into networking situations, and they try to just get over it. Sometimes it works briefly, and other times it creates exhaustion because exposure without identity change teaches your brain only one thing, that this is stressful and I happen to survive it. That's not confidence, that's endurance. And endurance, well, it has a ceiling, it has a limit. Just think about the last time you forced yourself into what felt like a high-stakes social situation. Maybe it was a really important networking event. Maybe it was a firm dinner or a conference where you told yourself, I'm going to be more outgoing this time. And how did it feel? If you're like most of my clients, it felt performative and draining. And afterwards, you probably told yourself, that's not me. I'm just not good at this. But here's what really happened. You took action from the same thought pattern that created the problem in the first place. You went into that room thinking, I don't belong here, I'm not good at this. Your brain didn't learn, I can do this. Instead, it learned, This confirms I'm bad at this. That's why repetition without thought work builds resentment, not confidence. Two people can have the same social experience. One thinks that's awkward, this proves I'm bad at this, and the other thinks that was clunky, I'm learning. Same behavior, same outcome, completely different neurological imprint. Neuroscience shows that the brain strengthens interpretations, not events. So if you repeat a behavior while rehearsing the same self-judgment, you're not building confidence, you're reinforcing that identity. This is why people can attend meetings and events and have conversations for decades without improving their social ease, because they're practicing the same thoughts. Let me make this even more concrete. You're at a client dinner and you try to make conversation with someone you don't know well. And so you ask a question and they give a short answer and turn to someone else. If your thought is, well, that was awkward, I shouldn't have said that, I'm terrible at small talk, your brain files that experience under evidence that I'm socially inadequate. But if your thought is, that person wasn't interested in that topic, I'll try a different approach with the next person, your brain files that experience under data that I can use to improve. Same dinner, same interaction, completely different wiring. So this isn't positive thinking. It's just choosing an interpretation that serves your growth model instead of one that reinforces your limitations. And that choice is always available to you. So what's the hidden cost of staying the same? Well, as the year comes to a close, many of you are noticing something. You've advanced technically in your field, you've taken on more responsibility, you've gained more experience, but socially, you still hesitate, overthink, and defer in rooms that you belong in. And the most damaging conclusion that they draw is this: I guess this is just who I am. That thought alone shuts everything down. Because once you decide something's fixed, your brain stops looking for evidence to the contrary. You stop noticing the moments when you could have spoken up and the opportunities to build relationships, and you stop recognizing that other people are just as uncertain as you are. They're just interpreting it differently. And here's the cost that no one talks about. You start to resent the people who have what you want. You tell yourself they're less substantive, they're all style, no substance, that they got lucky or they had advantages that you didn't. And maybe some of that's true, but it's also a way to avoid admitting that you've been standing in your own way because you thought the problem was confidence and it wasn't. You thought the problem was shyness or introversion and it wasn't. You thought the problem was a lack of polish or knowing the proper manners and it just wasn't. The problem is that your thinking never updated to match your current level of capability, so your brain is running an outdated model that's designed for much earlier, a much younger and decidedly less mature and knowledgeable version of you. A version that needed protection and that didn't have any authority or leverage. And that version of you also benefited from staying in the background and on the sidelines. And the wonderful news is that you're not that person anymore. Now you have the expertise that people need and the insights that move conversations forward and unquestionable value that deserves visibility. And until your thoughts catch up, your behavior won't. This is the single most important insight that I can give you. You're not lacking any specific people skills. You're practicing the wrong thoughts. And once you see that, everything will change. Because skills take time to build and thoughts can change immediately. And let me be very clear about this. A polished professional presence is something you learn to embody. In other words, it's a state. And states are created by thoughts and desires. Research in social psychology shows that people who direct attention outward, like, for example, toward contributions and toward others and toward the room that they've entered, are consistently rated as more confident and more charismatic than those focused inward. So presence is focus, and we choose what we decide to focus on, which means presence is available to you the moment you decide to think differently. Here's what presence will look like in practice for you. You walk into a meeting, and instead of thinking, everyone here is evaluating me, I need to prove myself. What if I say something wrong? Instead, you think, I'm here to contribute. What does this room need from me? That shift in focus changes everything, and you'll notice your body language opening and your voice steadying and your listening skills becoming sharper because you're not trapped in self-monitoring. So presence isn't a personality trait. It's a decision about where you put your attention, and that decision is always within your control. When you think about it, the most polished professionals aren't the most extroverted ones. They're the most intentional ones. They decided, consciously or not, that how they show up matters. Not because they're insecure, rather because they understand interpersonal leverage. Just look at everything we've discussed today. The extent to which you feel like a polished professional amplifies your competence. The manners you choose to use reduce friction. Your presence builds trust, and that trust accelerates everything. Just think about the people in your midst every day who have the kind of presence that you want. The ones who people greet eagerly and who are seen as leadership material. I guarantee you, they're not more talented, smarter, or luckier than you. They made a decision that you have not yet made. That showing up with polish and presence is worth the investment. And once you see it as an investment rather than a personality trait, your resistance is going to drop because you're very good at investments. You understand ROI and you know how to evaluate leverage, and social polish is high leverage. It multiplies the impact of everything else that you do. Here's the simplest, most confronting truth that I promised you earlier. Nothing external is stopping you. Not your personality, your past, or your temperament. The only thing standing between you and interpersonal success is a set of thoughts that you keep rehearsing about who you are and what's available to you. Your thoughts can change. You've changed your thoughts about other things. You used to think that you couldn't learn calculus, then you did. You used to think you couldn't manage complex financial models, then you did. You used to think you couldn't lead a team, then you did. Every capability that you now take for granted started with a thought shift from one identity to another. And this social identity shift that we're creating is no different. So as this year closes, I want to invite you to reflect differently and intentionally on what you believed, because I guarantee next year will look exactly like this one unless those beliefs are challenged and changed. You don't need to become someone else. You need to stop allowing decades-old thoughts and beliefs about your interpersonal capabilities to run your behavior. And that starts with your mind. What thought have you been practicing about your social capabilities, and what stories have you been telling yourself about who you are in professional settings? Those are the questions that matter, because once you answer them honestly, the path forward becomes very clear. If this episode unsettled you, that's not a problem. That's awareness, and awareness, when acted on, changes everything. You're capable of extraordinary growth in this area. You always have been. You just need to question the thoughts that told you otherwise. Thanks so much for joining me today. Bye for now. Wait, before you hit stop, let me leave you with this. Imagine walking into any meeting, dinner, or conversation and just settling in. Not bracing, overthinking, or wondering how you're coming across. Just knowing you belong and showing up like someone whose insight carries weight and who knows the protocol and can be comfortable everywhere. If that kind of ease and confidence feels a little out of reach right now, you're not alone. A lot of high performers feel less certain in the moments when presence matters just as much as competence, and that's the gap we close. Let's talk. We'll look at what's tripping you up, what you want to feel more confident doing, and what it would take to show up with social polish and presence that matches your performance. If you're ready to feel more solid, seen, and like the leader you know you can be, head to socialconfidencepro.com/coach and choose a time. It's literally your call.